I'd like to invite your attention this morning to 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16, beginning at verse 1. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, and it reads as follows. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send to you Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I've come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him trembling and said, "Do you come peaceably?" Samuel said, "Peaceably. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen any of these." Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And Jesse said, "There remains yet the youngest, but he is keeping the sheep." Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." Jesse sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. The Lord said, "Rise and anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel then set out and went to Ramah. For a few minutes, I want to talk about greatness in an unlikely place. Greatness in an unlikely place. Several years ago, there was a VH1 reality show called Charm School. It was a spin-off of Flavor Flav's reality show, which was called The Flavor of Love. Charm School was a reality show where 13 young women were assigned the challenge of developing proper etiquette in a competition for $50,000. But there was one episode that I remember most. The host of the show, which was Monique, took the young women to a social hour which consisted only of men. All the men in the room were players, except for one. The young women's assignment was to find that one exception. About 30 minutes of socializing had passed, and each of the young women thought they had discovered Mr. Right. The hostess of the show, Monique, called the young women to gather in an assembly to give a report on their experience. Sadly, none of them were able to discover Mr. Right. He was in the room the whole time, but because he did not fit the profile of the other men in the room, they looked right over him. In other words, because he did not look like everyone else, they made assumptions about him, which caused them to miss out. The truth is that both men and women are visual people. We make decisions based on how something looks, not based on whether it has substance, but how pleasing it is to the eye. In fact, American culture shapes us to believe that only looks matter and that image is everything. From the clothes we wear, the shoes we buy, the cars we drive, the neighborhoods in which we live, the schools our children attend, and the jobs we have, all these things contribute to our image. In other words, what people perceive about you is communicated by the image in which you portray. Sometimes we invest in our image to portray a certain persona. We buy the right clothes, we learn to speak a certain way, and we spend extra time grooming our hair and face. All those things shape our outer image, and we do these things hoping to get ahead. But I have a question for you today. What do you do when the image you shape for yourself is not enough? What happens when God says you didn't make the cut because you look too good, or you smell too good, or you speak too well, or your test scores are too perfect, your walk is too straight? What happens when God says, I know the outward appearance looks good, but I am looking for something else. I'm looking for something deeper. What do you do when God says you fit the profile, your resume is perfect, you've got the right social background, you have the right educational pedigree, but I'm looking for something fresh. I'm looking for something different. I'm looking for something that is unlikely. What do you do? Today's text that I read to you is a story about how God led Samuel to choose Israel's second king, David. But underneath the surface, it's a story about how God challenges our assumptions and expectations. It's a story about how God overturns stereotypes. In our text, Samuel and Jesse are caught up in looking at images. They're consumed by their ocular experiences. But God is concerned about a person's intentions. He's concerned about the interior. In fact, the text says in verse 7b, for the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. In other words, God will choose the unlikely person to be the most likely. And God does this to show us that everybody is a precious commodity in his kingdom, and that God's intentions outweigh our personal agendas and stereotypes. So as we look at this text, I want to submit to you that there are 4 circumstances in which God chooses greatness in an unlikely place. The first circumstance in which God chooses greatly from an unlikely place is when someone new is needed. When someone new is needed. The story begins in verse 1 with Samuel grieving. He's grieving over the failed leadership of King Saul. He's grieving over the fact that although Saul had the right image, he didn't have the right heart. So Samuel is crying and boo-hooing over someone that God said was not fit to continue in leadership. And at this point, Samuel is still grieving over, at this point in the story, is old news because God had fired Saul a long time ago. But while Samuel was grieving, God was looking for someone new. While Samuel was trying to hold on to what was, God was trying to bring in someone new. For you see, God had commanded Samuel to anoint Saul as Israel's first king. And both God and Samuel had invested a lot in Saul's kingship, but Saul ended up being a great disappointment to both God and Samuel. For you see, in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 10, God charged Saul with an ethics violation. For you see, God had commanded Saul to go pursue the king of the Amalekites and the king of Agag. But instead of killing everybody, Saul decided to kill everyone except King Agag. And in addition, Saul kept all the king's valuables, all the good stuff. And so God charged King Saul with an ethics violation. God fired him. He rejected him. And as a result, Samuel is now upset. He's angry. He's full of tears and he's full of grief. In other words, Samuel is grieving so much that his grief causes him to miss what God was trying to do. He could not see the new thing that God was trying to do. He could not perceive the new possibilities that were right before him. He could not imagine life any other way without Saul. He's hurt. He's burdened. He's disappointed. He's outdone. And he's in a state of grief-stricken shock. Samuel is grieving so much until it causes God to ask him, how long will you grieve over Saul? How long will you try to hold on to the old way? God says, I've rejected Saul. I've brought him up on an ethics violation. I have chosen someone new. I've selected a new person who can take this nation into areas that you haven't even seen before. But you keep trying to hold on to Saul. God says, get up from here, take your horn of oil, and go anoint the king whom I have chosen for myself. Several months ago, I started noticing that a pair of my dress shoes had started feeling different. They didn't have the same comfort they had when I had first bought them. In fact, my feet started to hurt some. But I thought it was my socks. And one day I looked at the bottom of my shoes and saw that I had a hole in them. Of course, I was very disappointed because these were my favorite pair of Venetian leather shoes. I wore them only on certain occasions, but I'd had them for over 10 years. And needless to say, although these shoes could no longer serve their purpose, I held on to them as long as I could until finally one day I had to accept the fact that I needed something new. I needed a new pair of shoes because my old pair were no longer useful. I want to submit to you today that some of us are holding on to stuff that's no longer useful to us. Many of you may be in situations in which you know God is calling for something new, but we hold on to things because they are familiar to us. We hold on because we've invested so much into it. And because we hold on, it keeps causing us grief. And we find ourselves singing the words of Anthony Hamilton's most popular song, "No matter what the people say, I can't let go." We try to hold on to things we know are not good anymore. God knows you cannot let go on your own strength. But God is always there to help us move from that which is no longer useful to that which brings new possibilities and life and restoration to our souls. So the first circumstance in which God chooses greatness in an unlikely place is when something new is needed. But the second circumstance in which God chooses greatness in an unlikely place is when everybody least expects it. When everybody least expects it. Notice here in verses 4 and 5 in the text that Samuel has now realized that God is creating a new order of leadership. So Samuel leaves his grief-stricken situation and goes to Bethlehem. He leaves his home city of Ramah to travel to Bethlehem because God told him that the next king is in Bethlehem. The next king is at old man Jesse's house. Notice what happens when Samuel arrives to the city. As soon as he comes to the gate of the city, the elders in the city are frightened. They are scared. They get nervous. Because whenever Samuel came to town as not only a judge, but also as a prophet, he always came to set things in order. He always came as a corrective to a situation. He always came to bring some kind of prophetic word. So the first question the elders ask when they see Samuel coming to the gate is, "Do you come peaceably?" In other words, the elders of the city want to know, why are you here? You only come when something is wrong. What has happened that requires your presence in our city? This makes sense because, again, Samuel only shows up when there is a problem. And when he shows up, his presence is always unexpected. In other words, whenever Samuel shows up, he is either anointing a king, condemning a king, or bringing a prophetic word from God. But Samuel tells the elders that he has come to bring peace. He has come to restore peace, and he invites them to partake in a sacrificial meal. He comes to the city unexpectedly. He shows up unexpectedly. I used to live in Cleveland, Ohio. And I remember on April 27, 2011, I received an unexpected phone call from my Aunt Grace. She had called to tell me that a deadly tornado had touched down in Birmingham and that it had destroyed much of the neighborhood in which I had grown up. And this is the same neighborhood in which my parents and my sister were currently living in. But she called to tell me that although everything was destroyed, the family was safe. No one was hurt. And my aunt also went on to say that the news had been warning people for a couple of days that a storm was coming. It had come unexpectedly, but nobody expected it to be that massive. Nobody expected it to be that deadly. And there are things that happen to us, such as tornadoes sometimes, that can happen unexpectedly. When God chooses someone with the right heart, the right image, it always catches us off guard. Because God often works in our midst when we are preoccupied doing something else. God works during the times in which we really are not paying attention, times in which we are really not discerning the signs of the time and being sensitive to the ebb and flow of God's Spirit. But one of the amazing things about God is that God does not always confine God's self to our timetable. God does not always work within the boundaries that we have established. And it seems as if God looks for opportunities to show up and interrupt the regularities of our lives. In other words, God chooses the most inopportune time to show up unexpectedly. God chooses greatness in unlikely places, first of all, when someone new is needed. Secondly, he does this when people least expect it. But the third circumstance in which God chooses greatness in unlikely places is when the standards of the time need to be redefined. When the standards of the times need to be redefined. Notice here in verse 6 of the text that Samuel has organized a potluck fellowship. The text says sacrificial meal. He's organized this potluck and invited Jesse and his 7 sons. Now, Samuel's goal is to anoint Israel's next king, but the problem is that Samuel is not using the right standards in choosing this king. In other words, Samuel knows he needs to look for a king, but he's not looking for the right criteria. He is not using the right blueprint. He is not looking at the stuff that matters. He's not looking for substance in a person. Samuel gets caught up looking at everything else except what's most important. Notice here that the first person Samuel sees is Eliab. And because Eliab has the right kind of swag about himself, Samuel assumes that he must be the right person. In other words, because Eliab is tall and walks with a steady stride, Samuel assumes that he must be king material, that he must be the man. And at that moment, God stops him and God prevents Samuel from making a big mistake. God stops Samuel and tells him, look, don't judge someone based on how they look. And if I can use my sanctified imagination, God tells Samuel, just because he looks like a king doesn't mean he's king material. Just because he's got the right kind of voice doesn't mean he's the one. Just because he can make women scream and holler doesn't mean he's the one. Just because he can sing like Luther Vandross doesn't mean he's the one. Just because he's got muscles like the latest bodybuilder doesn't mean he's the one. And just because he's smart doesn't mean he's the one. God tells Samuel, I know you are used to looking at how someone walks and talks. I know you are used to looking at images and being guided by what looks good. I know you are used to looking at superficial realities. I know you're used to looking at outer appearances, but God says, I've got a new standard. I know you're used to looking at strobe lights and glitter and confetti, but I've got a new standard. I know you're used to validating people by how popular they are, but I've got a new standard. God tells Samuel, for man, for humans, they look on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. This whole notion of redefining the standards of the time reminds me of the creation of the iPhone by Apple, because Apple redefined the cell phone industry. There are thousands of people who have iPhones, and I know there are some of you who are Android users who are listening to me. I'm sorry, I'm praying for you. But whether you are 12 years old or 75 years old, it seems like everybody either has an iPhone or wants an iPhone. And the days of using a cell phone just to make a simple phone call are now over. And in 2007, the release of the original iPhone changed the standards in the cell phone industry. And now with an iPhone, you can make phone calls, you can send a text message, you can surf the internet, you can pull up your calendar, you can use your phone as a GPS, you can now stream music through Apple Music, you can now type Word documents using Microsoft Word, you can create albums of your precious photographs on your iPhone. You can download thousands of applications to play video games and watch YouTube clips and even make videos and take pictures and do conference calls via Zoom and check the weather or ask for directions or even pull up your favorite restaurants. With the iPhone, you can do all of this and much more because Apple redefined the standards for cell phone use. Well, I want to submit to you that God, the all-powerful creator, the all-knowing God, the all-seeing God, sometimes will change the standards. God redefines the way things should be done. God isn't impressed with how we look or how something appears to be. God isn't impressed necessarily with how well we speak. God isn't looking for someone with a certain kind of walk. God isn't looking for someone with pretty brown eyes, but God is redefining the standards. God is looking for somebody with a good heart. God isn't necessarily looking for the right image, but God is looking at the heart. But the heart is where our true desires are, and a good heart always changes the standards. So perhaps you're tired of doing the same stuff in life. Maybe you've gotten bored with your spiritual life. Your prayer life has just become another boring thing to do, or worship is just not as exciting as it used to be. Or perhaps you are tired of living life according to what other people think you should do. I want to submit to you that God desires to redefine the standard for your life, and God wants to change the standards by which you live. God really wants to do something new. God chooses greatness in an unlikely place, first of all, when something new is needed. Second, God does it when people least expect it. Thirdly, God chooses a person with the right heart when the standards need to be refined. But the last is that God chooses greatness in an unlikely place when the unlikely person is the most likely. When the unlikely person is the most likely. Notice here in verses 11 and 13. Samuel went to Jesse's house expecting to choose a king by popular opinion. But God had another plan. Samuel went to Jesse's house expecting to find someone just like Saul. But God had another plan. Jesse brought all of his favorite sons before Samuel because he knew they were all prime candidates to be king. But God had somebody else in mind. And after Jesse paraded the best of his sons before Samuel, God said, none of them fit the profile. I've rejected them all. They all look good. They all smell good. They all walk right. They all speak well, but they don't fit what I'm looking for. In other words, they're just too good for this kind of work. Their resumes are too perfect for this kind of work. Samuel says to Jesse, is this all that you have to offer God? Is this it? I know God sent me here to anoint the king, but I don't see anything in here that fits the profile. I don't see anything in here that fits that which God is looking for. Jesse said, well, there is one more, but he's outside keeping the sheep. You see, Jesse didn't think his own son, his youngest son, was good enough to do anything but tend the sheep. Jesse didn't think his youngest son was good to do anything but be an errand boy. And certainly, David's brothers didn't think David was good enough to do anything but be the little brother. But the one that was the unlikely in God's book became the most likely. Yeah, Samuel summoned David, and what was once the black sheep of the family was now the one that would lead not only the family, but the whole nation according to God's plan. Sometimes people will place you in a box to keep you from reaching your full potential. People will try to block you from fulfilling that which God has called you to do. And sometimes people will intentionally leave you out because of who you are and how you are. They will leave you out because you don't do things how they do them, or you don't look the way they want you to look. They will leave you out of God's favor resting on your life. They will exclude you from the meeting because they don't have much faith in your abilities. They don't think you're worth the investment. And as a result, they will leave you out. But I've got some good news for you today. And that is, the person you leave out is the person that sometimes and most times is the most qualified. The person you try to block is the person that has God's favor resting upon their life. The person that we sometimes exclude and dehumanize and push to the side is often the person that God has invested in to lead us into God's plan. Many of us wonder sometimes if we're good enough to do something big for God. We know we have what it takes to get the job done, and sometimes we know we've got the right kind of heart, but we are not sure we've have the right kind of image, so we sell ourselves short. We talk ourselves out of following our dreams because we don't think we have the right image. Sometimes we don't think we really fit in. We're not sure that what we have to offer will make a big impact in our surroundings. But God says, you are the perfect candidate. Why? Because God does not look and major in superficial realities. But God looks at something deeper. For God told Samuel, man, humankind, women, men, they look on the outward appearance. But I look for something that is much more important, something that really, really matters. I look at the heart. I look at that which causes a person to be and to do. God says, I look at the heart. Don't allow images and personas to force you to invest in something that God has already abandoned. But allow God to enable you to look beyond superficial realities, because oftentimes God will choose greatness in a very unlikely place. God bless you.